Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
And welcome back to the Patrick Henningsen Show with me, Basil Valentine, guest hosting for Patrick today, Thursday, the 1st of August. I'll be seeing him at the weekend, and I will pass on all your good wishes. I'm delighted to say I'm joined on the line now by one of the wisest men in Scandinavia, the author, all-round good egg, and geopolitical analyst, Mats Nilsson. Welcome to the program, Mats.
Thank you, Basil. You flatter me, but I'll allow it for. I'll allow it for this time around. Yeah.
We haven't spoken for a while. A lot of water under the bridge in the last few weeks. We had, of course, Viktor Orban's freestyle peace mission to Beijing, Ukraine, Moscow. He's agreed now to put that on ice after European leaders sort of threatened to completely ostracize him. But at the same time, Zelensky is now saying he wants the Russians to have a seat at the next round of peace talks. Not that there have been any meaningful discussions so far. So please try and make sense for our viewers of what the latest is with respect to Ukraine. The F-16s have arrived, of course. Is Zelensky hoping to negotiate now from a position of greater strength and force the Russians' hand, or is he finally going to be realistic and realize that this can't go on forever? And the sooner the killing stops, the better.
No, I'm afraid realism isn't really part of Zelensky's vocabulary and hasn't been for some time now, or at least not by any chance. His handlers are not dealing with realism. If they had, things would have been much better. I think Zelensky's talk about including Russia is more or less one of these public perception games that's being played by Ukraine and the Ukrainian leadership in some kind of vain attempt to lure Russia into a false sense of security, which obviously they're not going to fall for. So one can only speculate he's pandering to a Western audience. The way I see it, considering all the new shiny weapons that are being delivered to Ukraine, I'm more along those arguing for the fact that Ukraine is preparing for a concentrated attack along the lines with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and somewhere in the southern area of the conflict. I don't see any viable situation where one, Zelensky would risk starting to talk about giving up territory to Russia, two, putting this to a referendum, which would be obviously in the best of cases, the political death of Zelensky. In the worst of cases, the real death of Zelensky due to disgruntled former soldiers. And thirdly, there is no way that Russia right now is willing to backtrack and say, oh, let bygones be bygones. You know, we could have made a amicable peace 2 years ago, but let's just forget about the 2 years and we'll go back to discussing where we were in 2021. It's not going to happen. It's not going to fly. Russia have already declared that we're heading onwards for as long as we deem necessary, until we see that we have the security under this form of Russian Monroe Doctrine that we need. So all Zelensky's talk about including Russian negotiations is just that. It's just talk, just hot air, and one of those things politicians do these days in the West, trying to pander to a Western audience in order to gain a foothold and gain sympathy. So no, I'm afraid I wouldn't deem it as credible.
Joe Biden's on his way out, of course, and as presidents often do towards the end of their tenure, they look for a few good news stories, and quite a bit is being made in Western media of the prisoner exchange between Russia and the West that's seen Evan Gershkovich and others freed in quite a major prisoner swap. Are us optimists to see this as possibly the first signs of a thaw in relations between Russia and the West?
I wouldn't go that far. It was an opportunity that both sides deemed advantageous to each of the involved parties. Now, the main good thing about this, and this is something that I really want to emphasize as being the legal historian that I am, this proves one point, which is very, very important for the coming months and years ahead. The West and Russia must obviously still have lines of communication open. This deal would not have been made possible unless, I believe, somehow Turkey was involved in mediating this arrangement. I haven't gotten down to the finer details of it as of yet, but obviously there is mediation, and somehow the channels somewhere are still open. And as long as these channels exist, actually as long as Russia and the West can make these arrangements, it gives me hope that they can also make arrangements in future to de-escalate before we reach that final horrid tipping point where everything goes kaboom for one final time. So I'm very happy. I'm very happy for all the involved prisoners. I'm very happy for all their families involved in this, but I'm also very happy for you and I and my own children, because it proves that there is diplomacy and negotiations still work. So that's my main take on this prisoner exchange story that happened.
Indeed, the exchange took place at Ankara airport in Turkey earlier this afternoon. Yes. And for what it's worth, Joe Biden called the deal a feat of diplomacy. And he's also vowed that he will not stop working until every American wrongfully detained or held hostage around the world is reunited with their family. If only he was prepared to put the same pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to end the war in Palestine. We'll come to that after the break. But it's not often we hear anybody talking about a feat of diplomacy these days. Diplomacy is equated with appeasement, and anybody wanting to talk to the other side is wanting to do a deal with the devil. So, yes, in that respect, this is definitely a step in the right direction. The German government has said its spokesperson did not take this decision lightly, and that the state's interest in carrying out the prison sentences of a convicted war criminal was weighed against the freedom, physical well-being, and in some cases, ultimately, the lives of innocent people. So a brief shard of enlightenment seems to have broken through the clouds of ignorance and hatred that spoil the diplomatic landscape these days, Mats.
Yes, and very, very much so. And also, I think that America realizes that they need the ability to use diplomacy, because the United States, its industry, its decision-making, basically the United States military is right now, in this very day, unprepared for a war that could kick off with Russia and China and Iran and perhaps grow from there. Because, America, the U.S. military, even after 20 years of huge investments, won't be able to uphold a global conflict. It's just you have all these new areas. You have the drones. You have the space and the cyber warfare. You have the hackers. You have the computer attacks that will come, and where chaos could be quickly created on America's home turf. So the Pentagon knows that all these weapon purchases that they have been making during the last decades are already outdated. America needs to start funding defense innovation units, which they obviously haven't. So I think as well, people in Washington, there are realistic military men in Washington and even within the Pentagon, are probably trying to hold back the politicians that are baying for blood due to the fact that they know a modern global war scenario isn't something that America right now could handle. Of course, they always have nukes, but still, no one wants to go there. And if you put the nuclear option off the table, then America is woefully inapt to deal with this kind of war. So Biden or whoever is in charge, Blinken or anyone else, probably somewhere realizes that getting diplomacy somehow back on the chessboard is a strategic move. And it's a move that's much needed for American society, because it would quickly collapse if the stranger or the stranger of a global war were to impact the American society today.
You're not kidding, Mats. We've got to take a very short break now. When we come back, I'll be asking whether the election of Donald Trump might make a difference. And also, of course, the mad dog amongst the nations of the world at the moment, Israel, determined, it seems, to kill as many people as possible on all its borders. We'll be right back after this short break.
We don't rock. We talk. Today's News Talk. TNT Radio.
The deal that made this possible was a feat of diplomacy and friendship, said Joe Biden. For anyone who questions whether allies matter, Biden said, today is a powerful example of why it's vital to have friends in this world. Our alliances make our people safer, he said. This is a very different tone from the outgoing president. It sounds more like his chief rival, Donald Trump, who said he will end the war in Ukraine possibly before even getting into the Oval Office while he's still president-elect. Am I being overly optimistic, Mats, when I say that the jungle drums seem to be finally beating in the direction of peace, at least where Ukraine is concerned, if not the Middle East?
Yes, Basil, you're being overly optimistic. It's not something I say with any amount of joy, but the difference in foreign policy between Trump and Biden in the White House will be marginal at best. Trump perhaps will shake a few more hands, perhaps he will open a few more channels, but even if he does something to alleviate the situation in Ukraine, the war-mad chihuahuas of the European Union, Poland, the Baltic states, partly Germany and the Nordic countries, they still want to stay involved in Ukraine, and they still want to keep the war going, as far as I can see. So I mean, it's Trump isn't in any sense of the word, able to get the sword of Alexander and cut the Gordian knot. And as when it comes to the Middle East, Trump may well be even worse for the situation in the Middle East concerning Iran and especially for the situation of the Palestinian people. Of course, as for myself, if I had been an American citizen, God forbid, but if we play with that thought, I would have gone and put my vote down for Jill Stein, the third party candidate. Obviously, that's not going to happen, and she isn't going to be anywhere close to the White House. But my point is, choosing between Trump and Biden, between Trump and Harris, isn't really that much of a choice. You're just going to get more of the same, but perhaps with a few touches of makeup here and there. But the general direction of the American imperial stance on how they want to control the world, that's still going to be there. Trump isn't going to back off, and of course neither is Harris.
No, and neither of them seem to want to place any kind of meaningful restraining leash on the mad dog that is Israel. And I choose my words carefully. In the last 24, 36 hours, Israel has murdered people in Iran, in Lebanon, and in the Gaza Strip. Just today, Gaza Civil Defense says at least 15 people have been killed in a strike on a school sheltering displaced Palestinians. Meanwhile, Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, has said that war with Israel has entered a new phase after the killings of its commander Fuad Shukur and the Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh. Israel's completely out of control at the moment. You've got protesters objecting to trying to storm facilities where soldiers have been arrested for mistreating Palestinians. The Israeli society has become so sick that they don't like the idea of people who torture being in any way held accountable, let alone the soldiers in Gaza. The carnage continues. Britain's Foreign Secretary and Defense Secretary have recently been in Qatar pressing for a ceasefire. Apparently that's what Kamala Harris said to Netanyahu when he was in Washington last week. But the Israelis simply don't care what anybody says or does. They're determined to press ahead with war on as many fronts as they want, safe in the knowledge that if things do turn really ugly and the knuckle dusters go on in the fight with Hezbollah, that the United States will come to their aid. It's the worst situation I can remember, Mats.
Yes, the situation has gotten, like you said, very tense very quickly, and it flares up. The Middle East is always on fire and has been as long as I can remember. Now, having lived in Israel and Palestine and having worked in the region, I've always said, since I experienced Israel firsthand while living there, that the only thing that's going to threaten the Israeli statehood is Israel itself. And by that I mean Israel can only be destroyed by Israel. And I think the conflict that happened when the military police were going to arrest these 9 soldiers is a much deeper conflict. It's a conflict between the Ministry of Defense, the Minister of Defense Gallant, and the Ministry of National Security, Ben Gvir. And it's a disintegration of the Israeli society that's happening right in front of us. And I would say civil war, a low-intensity civil war is right now likely. And where you could also see that maybe a fourth or up amongst more than that, maybe 30% of the Israeli population, those who deem themselves still being liberals, might actually not want to fight anymore because they don't want to fight for Ben Gvir and the ideology that says it's okay not to prosecute soldiers who have raped prisoners. So it's two ideological ideas who are now they're at the complete opposite of the Israeli political spectrum. And these two will come to a head shortly. So if you want to force Israel to the negotiating table, I would say that the powers who are, or the people who are occupied, the Palestinians, they should opt for a kind of color revolution within Israel. They should flame the fans, or fan the flames of this embittered internal strife within Israeli society. Because once that has gotten too difficult to handle, Israel will be forced to the negotiating tables. As long as Israel is united as a nation, there is basically nothing that can make them go to the negotiating table and start talking about the two-state solution. But once this happens, that Israel starts crumbling from within, where the cancer starts growing. In order to save whatever can be saved of the Israeli statehood, then they will have to start negotiating. So I'm sticking with my assessment that I made maybe 15, 20 years ago, that the thing that will destroy Israel eventually is Israel and the Israelis themselves. No external force will force them to negotiating tables, but the internals, perhaps even a civil war, will take them to the negotiating table.
Karim Makdisi is an associate professor at the American University of Beirut, and he told Al Jazeera that Israel is pursuing a strategy essentially to box the United States into a position of firm support for its ally, regardless of what it does. And that's certainly the evidence we had from that really grotesque spectacle of the mass murderer Benjamin Netanyahu being cheered by Congress, 58 standing ovations. I mean, would they have done that to Jeffrey Dahmer? I've no idea. Dahmer, far less dangerous individual than the homicidal psychopath Netanyahu. Karim Makdisi says, I think Israel are out of control in the sense that they're trying to create a situation in the region in which they remain in charge of what's going on, in which they are able to create all sorts of violence, assassinate at will, blow up civilian infrastructure at will, continue the genocide in Gaza, take on Iran, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, and other countries in the region, and not necessarily understand what the repercussions are going to be, he said. I do think there is a strategy there. I think the strategy, especially with Netanyahu just having come from the US, is to try to create this kind of atmosphere in the region in order to draw the Americans in and in order to scupper any kind of ceasefire talks. Certainly, if you assassinate the leader of the political wing of the organization with whom you're supposed to be negotiating a ceasefire, you can't really be acting in good faith. Britain never assassinated Gerry Adams or Martin McLaughlin, even at the height of the troubles in Northern Ireland. I think he's absolutely right. It seems Israel is testing the United States, behaving in the most egregious ways possible, but knowing that it's got this full court press on Congress through AIPAC and the bought and paid for representatives on Capitol Hill. It's not a pretty picture, Mats.
No, of course not, and it never has been. But the thing, and like I said, the thing is that American politicians are going to stand behind Israel all the way. But if Israel suddenly becomes two states, one the state of Israel that Americans can somewhat understand, and the other the state of Judea, where you have these die-hard nationalist, colonialists, individuals who want to eradicate all Palestinians, then perhaps America will have to back off, but never before.
Well, unfortunately, some people like Mike Pompeo and other Republicans support those lunatic settlers. They have no regard for international law. As Nicholas Soames said in the House of Lords last week, if we lose what we have left of international law, we're going to be in a very, very dark place. Mats Nilsson isn't in a dark place at all. He's in Sweden in the summer. It's great that you could join us today, Mats.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Basil.